Sounds like they're dragging a dead body above me. Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I'm back with my hot glue gun. So in about December of 2021, I did receive an Adler J3 for Christmas. My mom found it in an antique store for about $16, but the problem with it was it didn't come with a case. Now, nothing else was wrong on this typewriter. It was in beautiful condition. All I had to do was sit down and clean it, and I did decide to name it Irene after Irene Adler because literary references. Now, I always suggest when you're buying portable typewriters to buy ones with a case. They're great for storing them, great for transporting them. They just help protect the machine overall, and portables usually come with cases. Now, this machine didn't come with a case, so it was kind of just out there in the open. It wasn't super protected, and when I moved, I was worried it would get broken in transit because it didn't have that nice shell case around it to hold it in place. Now, I did pack it safely in a box with lots and lots and lots of bubble wrap, but it was just something I wanted to find a way to protect after the fact. One of the things I've noticed about typewriter cases is their dimensions are quite specific because typewriters are a strange shape. They're kind of square, so the cases are also square, and they also have to fit kind of the right dimensions for a typewriter. They're a little bit deeper than a normal suitcase and more square than a normal suitcase. So as I was looking at finding a way to house my Adler J3, I was thinking about maybe finding some sort of vintage case to put around my Adler, and that started the hunting process. So I started by measuring my machine. Again, the dimensions on these are very strange. They're much more square, and they are pretty deep. So I did measure from side to side, from front to back, and from top to bottom. Now, in addition to these measurements, I also added a couple inches to my measurements on each side to make sure that when I got a case, it wasn't exactly hitting up against the platen knobs. It had just a little bit of space around where I might be able to add some padding or something to protect the machine, again, in transit. So I started my hunt. I went to antique shops, I went to thrift stores, I went to estate sales, and I brought my measuring tape. Or I brought my dad's measuring tape because I was stealing his measuring tape for a while, till I got my own. So I went through and measured a bunch of these vintage suitcases. That's where I really thought I was going to end up. I would measure the length of them, the width of them, and the depth of them. What I found was these vintage suitcases, while beautifully built, and a lot of them are available out there, they're just the wrong dimensions for carrying something like a typewriter. They're not as deep as you might need on a typewriter. Typewriters can be pretty deep, especially this one, and they're also really wide. I didn't need a full large rectangle. What I really needed was something that I could buffer the sides of. You don't want a ton of slop space in your case because that means your typewriter could bounce around a lot within it, especially if it's not being bracketed to the bottom like it might be in a traditional typewriter case. So I hunted, I measured lots of suitcases, I went to different antique store locations and also measured those suitcases. I tried to find empty typewriter cases on eBay or Facebook Marketplace. I looked at a bowling ball bag. I tried to think of any option that might be a great way to portably transport this Adler J3. And just when I was about to give up looking, I ran into this file folder case in a consignment shop. Now, this case was about $8, and it didn't have any padding on the inside, but I did like quite a few things about it. First of all, it was definitely deep enough to house the Adler J3 with some padding, so I didn't have to worry about it being bumped up and down within the case. I was able to pad inside of it. I also liked it had a really strong handle, and I liked how it enclosed. It has two flaps that go over each other and then lock in place, which I really liked as a way to kind of secure the typewriter. It was lightweight, it was nice and square, and it wasn't too wide like some of those suitcases I was looking at compared to how deep or how lengthwise it was. I don't know how you measure suitcases, but I liked the shape of it compared to some of those more travel-based suitcases that you would find in your local antique store. So I bought that and then realized I wasn't ready to work on that project for a very long time. I ended up having this suitcase in about February after getting the typewriter in December, and then it just sat around storing stuff until I moved in July. I actually found a bunch of styrofoam pieces while we were getting stuff from my new apartment, and I shoved them into this case and then brought it with me to my new apartment, and then one weekend I finally decided to break out the hot glue gun. Now, what I ended up doing was I took this case, I cleaned it out with Simple Green just to make sure I was getting off all the dust and nasty stuff inside of it, and then I took these styrofoam pieces and started placing them within the case. I wanted to protect the corners of the case specifically, and I also wanted to make sure I was protecting protecting the sides. Anywhere where that carriage might travel, I don't want any broken platen knobs or any broken pieces on the machine. So I started laying them in there and then testing the typewriter in there to make sure it was going to continuously fit in the case as I added more and more styrofoam padding. Once I had the dimensions right and the placement of those styrofoam pieces in there correct, I hot glued them into the case using my hot glue gun. I wanted to feel like I could remove these pieces after the fact in case I found some other use for this case or found something better for my Adler. Now once I hot glued these pieces in, I kept testing it to make sure that the machine was going to fit. One thing I didn't think about was making sure it would fit lengthwise and that I could still close the case. So I put the Adler in and I went to close up the case to make sure it would fit, and I realized I had put too much padding on the back plate of this case. So I had to go in and cut down those pieces to size using an X-Acto knife, so I was still having padding in the back section of the typewriter case. I wanted to make sure every angle of this thing was padded, and then I was able to fit the case back in. I was able to fit the typewriter back in the case to make sure it was going to fit. Once I had all of my styrofoam pieces in place, I then went in with just some black fabric to cover up the styrofoam and kind of encase it a little bit and put just, again, another buffering layer, but also make it look kind of nice. And I also hot glued that in place. So here is the final result. Now, when it comes to finding typewriter cases, you do have a few options. You can look on resale sites, right? And look at eBay, Etsy, Shop Goodwill, look for empty cases. Sometimes they end up in the suitcase portion of those online retailers or Facebook Marketplace. Sometimes if you look for empty vintage suitcases, you might find a typewriter case. I myself have found typewriter cases just shoved in luggage walls before. Sometimes they have typewriters in them, sometimes they do not. So you might be able to find an empty case out there, but it is kind of hard to find those because often they are with the typewriter they came with, and it was more likely that the case would break before the typewriter. So people usually didn't keep the cases after the machine was gone. I like cases that do have that bracketing in them because you know your typewriter is nice and snug and secure in there. But when you don't have a case for your machine, you kind of have to make stuff up as you go. I think suitcases might be a great option for these, but I didn't like how wide they were compared to my machine. I just didn't want that much slop space in there for something to break in transit as it was jostling around. I also know some people have found great case options at Harbor Freight. Nice big tough plastic cases that you can put your typewriters in and also pad, and that's a great way to get a hard shell case for your machine. This is the option I went with, which is kind of on par with my DIY spirit, and I do think it's a great way to kind of store the machine. I would advise never to stack this like you would a portable case like I have in my corner over here, just because it is a softer shell case. It's not really built to be stacked under things, but for transporting, it's got a nice handle on it, and I think this is a great way for me to move my Adler from one place to another. One other thing I think is important to mention when you're putting a typewriter in a case that's not designed for it is you want to make sure that you're either putting the lock on it or setting your margins to center, or doing both to keep that carriage from moving back and forth, because you don't want it sliding around in the case, hitting the sides, breaking a platen knob, or breaking your case. So that's a great way to kind of ensure that it's going to be safe in there. My Adler does come with a lock on it, so I was able to engage that and also set my margins to center, so when I was placing it in the case, it was nice and snug and safe. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do have some more videos on this YouTube channel, and I also have an Instagram at just.my.typewriter. I want to thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my typewriter. Coaster! I found it! This has been missing since I moved.